Good afternoon. My name is Bill Herbert, and welcome to our panel on the growth in union density among academic labor 2013-2019. I'm the National Center's Executive Director and a Faculty Associate at the Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute at Hunter College, City University of New York. And so what we're going to be discussing today is an upcoming report from the National Center which analyzes data from the period of 2013 to 2019 involving growth and unionization among faculty, graduate students, and postdoctoral scholars. The publication will be open source, and we anticipate it'll be available in the next few weeks. Let me introduce my co-panelists and co-authors of the report. Jacob Akarian is an assistant professor of sociology at York College, City University of New York, and a National Center Research Fellow. Joseph Vandenald is a doctoral student in the program in sociology at the CUNY Graduate Center and is a National Center graduate student researcher. We are truly privileged today to have two distinguished scholars who will be providing commentary relating to the findings in our upcoming report. Let me introduce them. Adriana Kazar is professor of higher education at the University of Southern California and director of the Pullias Center for Higher Education. Ariana is co-author of the recent book, The Gig Academy, Mapping Labor in the Neoliberal University. Gary Rhodes is a professor of higher education at the University of Arizona. Gary's books include Managing Professionals and Academic Capitalism and the New Economy. Gary is co-editor of the National Center's Journal of Collective Bargaining in the Academy and is a member of our Board of Advisors. So this report that we have coming out is going to, I want to review some of the summary of our findings from the report. First is we found that there's been continued growth in faculty unionization of about 10%, both in the total higher education, both sectors. Particularly, there's been a massive increase in represented contingent faculty, particularly in private sector. There's been greater growth in the four-year institutions relative to two-year institutions, which is a change because historically two-year institutions, community colleges, have been the driver of growth in unionization over time. We've also found a shift in faculty union affiliations towards non-traditional education unions, particularly SEIU and the UAW. We also examined, and this is for the first time in one of our directories, the level of representation among postdoctoral scholars. And we found that over 14,000 postdoctoral scholars are represented in higher education by labor unions. And finally, we found a substantial increase in represented graduate student employees since 2016, when the National Labor Relations Board issues its decision in Columbia University. So the National Center has been around since 1972, and since then, it has collected and reported on data concerning faculty unionization, collective bargaining contracts, and strikes in higher education, to the exclusion of others who work in higher education. The data periodically was aggregated and published in annual and semi-annual directories of contracts and bargaining agents at colleges and universities. The last directory in 2012 included information about the union density among graduate students. The directories have reported the number and size of faculty bargaining units, bargaining agents, contracts, institutional characteristics, location, and sector. But the directories have also applied different methodologies and also had different data points in terms of its analysis. Since 2013, the National Center has tracked over 250 formal representation efforts among faculty, administrators, postdoctoral scholars, and/or graduate employees. So let me just review briefly our research methodology for the 2020 supplemental directory. We collected the data primarily from primary source documents rather than relying on survey responses. There's a reason for that. The level of unionization drives that were taking place, formal unionization drives, was moving very rapidly, so survey instrument would have been inefficient. But the primary sources we utilized was the National Labor Relations Board and public sector agency documents in terms of certifications, decisions, and election tallies. We also looked at documents posted on government, university, and union websites. We utilized Westlaw also to supplement our research, as well as formal and informal responses from agencies and institutions of higher education and unions. I should mention that and give a shout out to the people who work at these labor relations agencies for the fine work they do in keeping their websites updated with new data. It's very helpful for researchers. I know that during his keynote address, Steve Greenhouse mentioned some changes at the National Labor Relations Board on substantive decisions. I should mention that in the past year, the National Labor Relations Board took down most of the data that we've been utilizing and we've taken from taking down the documents rather from their website and has made the website a lot more difficult to utilize for purposes of research, which is very unfortunate. At the same time, public sector agencies have been doing a great job in keeping the documents posted on a very timely basis. Last, I should mention about the supplemental directory, we have a COVID-19 caveat, which is the number and size of the units that we're going to be describing may change because of the pandemic. So what does the 2020 supplementary directory have? Well, first, our intention is to supplement the 2012 directory with data and analysis for the time period of 2013 to 2019. And we've also identified and provide data for units omitted from the 2012 directory, both among faculty units as well as graduate student units. And we also list and provide data for all new faculty and student employee units since 2012. Now we have three new features in this 2012 directory that I wanted to highlight. One is that we have data about unionization of postdoctoral scholars and academic researchers, which has never been analyzed previously by the National Center. Secondly, in a directory, there will be links to the actual composition of each new bargaining unit since 2012. So questions about actually titles in bargaining units, when we say combined bargaining units, we actually will know what titles and how frequently certain titles are included in faculty units. And lastly, probably most importantly, we're going to have links to current contracts for each new unit since 2012. This has been a perennial issue in higher ed, which is the availability of contracts. And we're pleased to say that, that with the exception of one institution, we've been able to attain copies of PDFs of contracts, which we now are going to be including in our directory, which is going to be an online directory, which we will be updating with new contracts as they get finalized. So now I just want to review, what we did was in preparation for this presentation, we looked back at prior directories to give a sense about the growth in faculty collective bargaining over a time span. And we started with the 1976 directory, which was the first one that we could find in our archives. And what you see in this graph is that the driver in higher education has always been the public sector. And you see the comparison between the total units and the public units. In the private units, you see that there's a very little movement between 1976 and 2012. One of the key drivers of the comparative differences is one in the public sector, where many states in the 70s and later have been passing statutes granting collective bargaining rights for public sector employees, including those working in higher education. In contrast, in the private sector, which is covered by the National Labor Relations Act, the first time that statute became applicable to higher ed was in 1970 with a decision in Cornell University. By 1976, there were only 65 private sector units in higher education. And as we'll show later on, is that the level of growth by 2012 is only 77 units. Part of the reason for that lack of growth in the private sector has to do with two seminal decisions by the Supreme Court. The first one relates back to what Steve Greenhouse talked about, which is this interpretation of the National Labor Relations Act, which says that the NLRB should not assert jurisdiction over religiously affiliated universities. This rule of non-jurisdiction has been utilized by many institutions as a union avoidance strategy. So the level of union density among religiously affiliated universities has been limited by the use of that case. But a bigger, a more significant decision came down in 1980, which is the Yeshiva University decision, which held that faculty who are engaged in shared governance are managerial by definition and therefore exempted from the protections of the National Labor Relations Act. That decision led to a substantial number of decertifications following it through the 80s, and the National Center spent quite a lot of time researching the impact of that decision. But the reality is that that decision led to making it extremely difficult for tenure track faculty to be able to unionize effectively unless the university did not seek to use the decision as a union avoidance strategy. But what's also happened, though, in this period of 1976 to 2012 has been the extraordinary expansion in the use of non-tenure track faculty over tenure track. Non-tenure track faculty are generally not included in shared governance, and therefore the yeshiva decision really has no application because of that. Despite the yeshiva case, there are some advocates who argue that private sector non-tenure track faculty should be involved in shared governance, but there are consequences for that because there have been cases not that during this period, the past 7 years, where universities have used that to argue that non-tenure track faculty are managerial because faculty sit on committees. So the other thing that we wanted to point out is, in terms of the historical perspective, is to realize that the growth in unionization has been primarily in 2-year institutions as opposed to 4-year institutions. And you see the split line here on the graph showing that the 2-year institutions are the drive, has been the driver in unionization growth over time. And last, I want to point out the question of union affiliation. The 3 national education unions, AAUP, AFT, NEA, have been the major drivers for most of, since collective bargaining resumed since 1963 with community colleges and forward to even to 2012. You see the level of which the NEA has been the most prolific in representing units, followed by AFT, then followed by AAUP. Beneath that are others, and those others include SEIU and UAW and Communication Workers of America, as well as UE to some extent, as well as the Steel Workers Union. But those are the others. And so what we're doing I'm trying to place this our data findings in this context of this history that has been taking place, which the National Center has been following closely over the decades. So now I'd like to turn over the panel to my colleague, Jake Apkarian, who's now going to discuss some of the findings that we've made in our directory. Jake?
Thanks, Bill. So Bill just kind of looked at, what's been happening in collective bargaining of faculty units for the 37 or so years up until 2012. And that was, the point of our most recent directory. And then the supplemental directory covered the subsequent years, 2013 to 2019. So what I want to do is start talking about what happened with faculty bargaining units since 2012. So what we found was there was an 18% increase in the total number of faculty bargaining units during that period, which amounted to 115 total new faculty bargaining units in higher education. The interesting thing is the rate of growth over this recent period was about 16.5 new units per year, which is higher than what we saw in the decades prior to 2012. So obviously there's ebbs and flows, and certain years have a lot of activity more than other years. But in general, in that almost 40-year period leading up to 2012, we saw about 9 new units per year. But in the recent period, we've seen over 16 new units. So definitely a jump in activity in terms of the rate of growth. And where that growth has been occurring, Bill, if you go to the next slide, Joey put together this nice heat map for us. And you can see, a lot of things we would expect: the East Coast, the West Coast, Illinois had a lot of new units. But I do want to just point out Nevada, a new unit in Nevada, Duke in North Carolina. We saw a lot of activity in Florida, mostly in the public sector. And these are all right to work states, right? And even Michigan recently, I think 2015, became a right to work state. We saw some new units there as well. So there is activity in higher ed in these new faculty bargaining units in right to work states, which is, I think, noteworthy. If we go to the next slide, I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about representation. So we talked about growth in new units, but that doesn't perfectly translate to growth in the number of faculty represented. So we do see steady linear growth here, right? It fluctuates year to year, but if you follow that light purple line, back one, Bill. The light purple line, it is pretty steady linear growth. But as we said, it's only about a 10% growth in actual represented faculty. So though we saw an 18% growth in new units, the fact that we only saw a 10% growth in faculty implies that the size of the units are smaller relative to what we've seen, in those few decades prior to 2012. Now I want to switch to one of our key findings. So Bill showed you this slide earlier, and it was a similar graph, but only went up to 2012. And what he said was the public sector has pretty much been driving growth in collective bargaining amongst faculty, right? So that purple line there is the total number of units of faculty units, right, in all of higher ed. And the blue line is the public sector, right? And you can see as the blue line goes, so goes the purple line, right? The red line, which is the private sector, has been relatively flat. We've seen some minor fluctuations, but not much changed until 2012. Since 2012, we see, everybody can notice that there's this kind of, it looks small because of the compressed scale, but a spike. It almost doubles, right? So the total number of private sector faculty bargaining units almost doubled since 2012 by the end of 2019. And you can see now that was the actual driver over that period, right? The public sector growth maintained its steady pace, and you see a jump in the total overall numbers, and that's due to this burst of activity in the private sector. And we can see it more clearly in the next slide, where we look just at, if I look at just that red line from the last slide, I'm looking at the total number of faculty bargaining units in private institutions, 1976, 86, so on. You can see there's fluctuations, but it was relatively stable until 2012, and then, that 2019 number, you can really see there was 65 new units over that period, and it jumped from 77 to 142. Now, if we go to the next slide, so as we've been saying, there's been pretty much no growth in the private sector up until 2012. Well, since 2012 through the end of 2019, the majority of growth occurred in the private sector. So 57 of all new faculty bargaining units occurred in the private sector. And I said it almost doubled, and to be precise, it was an 81% increase in the number of faculty bargaining units in the private sector. And the interesting thing, as Bill mentioned, with the yeshiva decision, the majority, 95% of these units were exclusively non-tenure track units, right? And so we can even zoom in on that little thing on the next slide, Bill, and we can examine. This is looking at new faculty bargaining units at private institutions only. We can see that in blue, those slices of the pie that are in blue, those are exclusively non-tenure track units. 62 of the 65 new units in the private sector were non-tenure track units. The other 3 were mixed units, no exclusively tenure track units, yeshiva decision. So that's kind of our first major finding, at least as it comes to faculty collective bargaining, that there's been a shift where it's the activity has really increased in the private sector, specifically amongst the contingent faculty, the non-tenure track faculty. Now let's shift to the second point that we want to make, which is 2-year versus 4-year institutions, and this is closely tied to the previous point. You can see up till about 2012, 1 in 3 new units was in 4-year institutions, and 2 in 3 were at 2-year institutions. So again, the driver of growth in faculty collective bargaining was at community colleges. Until 2012, we see this spike here, and it's not that it settled off in 2-year, it continued at a steady pace, but there just was a burst of growth at 4-year institutions. And this was largely driven by the fact that there was a burst in the private sector, and these tend to be 4-year institutions. So if we go to the next slide, we can see that these are all the new units over this period, and 65 of these new units were in the private sector in red. But it turns out in the public sector as well, we saw a shift. The majority of new faculty bargaining units in the public sector occurred at 4-year institutions as well. So again, historically, through 2012, in the 4 previous decades, only 1 in 3 new faculty bargaining units was at a 4-year institution. In this most recent time period, 80%, right? So 4 out of 5 new faculty bargaining units were in 4-year institutions. So another interesting shift here. The final shift that I want to talk about, the final interesting finding that we have as it relates to faculty bargaining units, is related to the bargaining agents. So as Bill mentioned, until 2012, the kind of big three education unions, AAUP, AFT, NEA, they've been driving growth, right? And by that, I mean, you can look at this other category we've made in the light pink line there at the bottom. This is any union that is not one of those three unions, right? And it's been relatively stable, right? They've represented about 50 bargaining units for that almost that 4-decade stretch. But then since 2012, it's not that there's been a decrease amongst the big three. They've continued their steady work, but there was massive amount of activity by non-traditional education unions. And so if we want to get a specific breakdown on the next slide, we can see it's mostly the work of SEIU here. So this is a breakdown of all new faculty bargaining units in higher ed since 2012 through the end of 2019. And we can see that SEIU represented 60% of these new units. So 3 in 5 new units, right, in the past 7 years through the end of 2019 were organized by SEIU. So 60% of new units, it turns out it's about 65% of newly represented employees. You might say to yourself, well, you said earlier this, these new units tend to be smaller. So, how does that translate to actual density in terms of the number of workers? SEIU is of the newly represented workers during that 7-year span, 65% of those workers were organized by SEIU. And this is really because there's been a focus in the private sector. So Bill, if you want to go to the next slide, did you want to add something? You're on mute, Bill.
A rare moment. So
I saw you talking over there, and I.
thank you. No, just that when we are describing faculty units, some institutions have more than one unit in the private sector,
Should have
and
said that.
just to make sure that so places like Tufts and other larger institutions could have as many as 3 units, and we're counting units, not individual faculty members.
Right. So when we talk about new units, right, that there are many times multiple new units formed on a single campus, right? So I'm not necessarily talking about new, the distinct number of institutions with new units, but the actual overall number of new units. But so we said SEIU has organized 60% of new units over this time period. It's been largely in the private sector, right? So we've showed with this data that there's been a major boost or in activity, I guess we could call it, in the private sector. That's been largely driven by SEIU. And Bill, if you look at the next slide, this is the breakdown of bargaining agents in these new private sector units. And SEIU has represented 56 of the 65 new faculty bargaining units in the private sector, which is 86%, right? So, I guess to kind of review these points that I made, the private sector has, since 2012, been driving growth in faculty collective bargaining, right? And there's been this shift towards 4 years, which is largely due to this shift towards private sector organizing. And SEIU is kind of the main driver of this private sector organizing, representing 86% of the new units in the private sector. So I'm going to kind of end the discussion of the faculty bargaining units here and turn it over to Joey to talk about some of the other stuff.
Just before we get to Joey's presentation, just should mention the relationship in the public sector to the question of the growth in public sector statutes for collective bargaining. Most of the inherent in most of the growth since 1963 in the public sector has been this passage of collective bargaining statutes in various states. There have been obviously some states which have stepped back in terms of the Wisconsin and now South Dakota, which have eliminated public sector collective bargaining. But there has not been a tremendous amount of growth in among new statutes that have granted higher ed collective bargaining. So in Colorado and in Virginia, the statutes that have granted others the right to collectively bargain have not included faculty in higher education. If those laws change, we'll probably see a very, very big new wave of growth in the public sector as states start to pass collective bargaining statutes applicable to public sector higher ed. So now we're going to ask Joey is going to present data regarding postdoctoral scholars and data with respect to the growth in graduate student employee representation. Joey?
Great. Thanks, Bill, and thanks, Jake. So as Bill mentioned earlier, one of the key findings, what we see as one of the primary contributions of the Center's supplemental directory, is that we've recorded over 14,000 unionized postdoctoral scholars and academic researchers in distinct units at US higher education institutions. So these are units that are composed entirely of postdoctoral scholars or academic researchers. So this is significant, we argue, because postdoctoral scholars and academic researchers are one of the fastest growing categories of precarious or contingent workers in the US higher education industry. So in the supplemental directory, we record 7 distinct postdoctoral scholar and/or academic researcher bargaining units, and 4 of those 7 were formed between 2012 and 2019. So of the 7 total units that we record, we find that the UAW represents 6, and that the AAP and AFT jointly represent the 7th unit. So we note that the total number of unionized postdoctoral scholars is actually greater than 14,000, because this figure excludes postdoctoral scholars that have been organized within combined units with faculty, okay? So such units exist at Fordham University in the private sector and at universities like Oregon State and University of Oregon in the public sector. Slide please, Bill. Yet another of the directory's key findings concerns growth in unionized graduate student employees, particularly at private universities. So of the 16 new graduate student employee units established between 2013 and 2019, 11 units, approximately 69%, are located at private universities. Further, we find that 79% of all newly unionized graduate student employees, so 79% of all newly unionized workers, are located at private universities as well. So this is a notable departure from the sectoral patterns of graduate student employee unionization in the recent past. Before the 2013-2019 period, no graduate student employees were unionized at private universities, whereas by the end of 2019, there were more than 15,000 unionized graduate student employees. Further, 11 of these new graduate student employee units at private universities, of those 11 new units, fully 8 of these units have already reached collective bargaining agreements with their institutions, which is a notable growth in the collective bargaining among this category of workers. Slide please, Bill. So here we can see the growth in organized graduate student employees by year in the period we examine in the supplemental directory. A more fine-grained look, year by year growth, as well as the total growth over the period. So I want you to note, as Bill had pointed out earlier, that the majority of growth in unionized graduate student employees occurred really in 2 years, 2017 and 2018, after the National Labor Relations Board reached its Columbia University decision granting unionization rights to graduate student employees at private universities. Slide please, Bill. So further disaggregating this growth in new graduate student employee units by bargaining agent, we can see that the majority of units are represented by UAW, but also SEIU. Slide please. However, if we disaggregate instead the growth in newly organized graduate student employees by bargaining agent, we can see that the UAW represented by far the largest proportion of newly organized workers, followed by the AFT. So the UAW's overwhelming majority here is really due to the large representation of large units at private universities, including at Harvard, Columbia, and New York universities, as well as the New School, in addition to a sizable unit at the University of Connecticut, which is a public institution. And units we should note at Harvard, Columbia, and the New School also include undergraduate student employees. So this pattern is really consistent with the findings of the 2012 directory issued by the National Center, where the UAW and AFT represented the first and second largest single proportions of graduate student employees nationwide. Yet when we look at the breakdown of new units by bargaining agent in the prior slide, we can see that unions like ASME, the Teamsters, and SEIU are increasingly beginning to organize graduate student employees. Can you go to the next slide, Bill? And then one more. Oh, that one, great, thank you. Finally, if we disaggregate newly organized grad student employees by state, we find that the states with the largest growth are concentrated on the East Coast, most prominently, as you can see, in Massachusetts and New York. And this is again due to sizable units of student employees at institutions like Columbia and Harvard. But if we compare this national distribution of unionized graduate student employees to the one that's documented in the Center's 2012 directory, we can see some evidence of a geographic shift in student employee organizing. At the end of 2012, 31% fully of organized graduate student employees total resided in California, whereas there was 8% in New York and 5% at institutions in Massachusetts. Whereas you can see by the end of 2019, the majority of growth in this period is concentrated in New York and Massachusetts, and that there were no newly organized graduate student employees in the state of California between 2013 and 2019. So I'm going to hand this back off to Bill, who's going to review a summary of our findings.
So one of the key findings, a key takeaway, is the reality that the faculty, the academic labor in higher education, who are the most precarious, are the ones who are driving collective unionization and collective bargaining in higher ed during the period of our 7-year study. And that would include non-tenure track faculty, the postdoctoral scholars, and the graduate student employees. One thing to keep in mind with regard to the graduate student employee issue is remember that they were one of the first groups of people who were doing work to be challenged in terms of their employee status, not unlike issues of misclassification that people who are being labeled as independent contractors are facing. Well, the difference is the graduate student employees have been historically challenging that with support of unions, primarily private sector unions, and challenging to fight for employee status for purposes of collective bargaining. And what we see is that when the Columbia University decision was issued, granting reinstituting labor rights for graduate student employees, there was a huge growth in unionization. And I think this is an example of sort of the interrelationship between law and mobilization and organizing, that you see that there's a direct connection. Many of these campuses were, this is true for tenure track, non-tenure track faculty as well. Many of these institutions have had long histories of organizing taking place. And once the law allows for there to be unionization, things take off considerably. So there has been, again, steady linear growth of faculty collective bargaining over the past 7 years. That growth is driven in large part by the continued faculty, as Jake said, at private institutions, with SEIU leading the shift. The growth, again, is in 4-year institutions relative to 2-year institutions. And the growth in graduate student employee units were driven by the post NLRB decision in 2016, the Columbia University decision. And a significant number of postdoctoral scholars now have representation. So let me just, in concluding, just cover some of the limitations about our study as well as the future. Let me start with the future, because it's something that's on the horizon that people should be aware of with respect to the graduate student employees in the private sector. The National Labor Relations Board is currently examining or has proposed a rule which Steve Greenhouse mentioned, which would rather than a decision that would take graduate student employees and all student employees outside the protection of the National Labor Relations Act. If that rule gets adopted, that would mean that approximately 80,000 graduate students at private institutions would no longer have statutory rights to unionize and engage in collective bargaining. In response to the proposed rule, the National Center filed comments about the proposed rule, in which we delineated the data that we have been collecting, including links to all the to 20 contracts involving graduate students that have been negotiated, current contracts that are negotiated, to show the kinds of terms and conditions of employment that have been negotiated. The rule is yet to be adopted as a final rule. And it's likely, like with the discussion over Title IX regulations, that if there's a change in administration, that the effort to eliminate graduate students from the coverage under the National Labor Relations Act would probably not take place. But we'll have to wait and see what transpires in the next weeks and months. Another aspect of the limitations to our study is the unit sizes and in our calculations of the number of faculty. Because these were units that were recently formed, we relied upon eligible voters in representation elections. That's where the vote tallies were so important, to see how many employees were considered to be in the bargaining unit. that's subject to change for a variety of reasons over time, and we'll have to look at that later on in terms of re-examining these units over time. But that's certainly one limitation. The other is, again, going back to the COVID-19 caveat, we've already seen some institutions laying off faculty, and some institutions that have these new collective bargaining units. And so that will have an impact on unit sizes and composition. And there's also discussions about mergers of institutions, which could also have an impact in terms of our data. But one thing one of our initiatives over the past 6 months has been the National Center has started a research project on collective bargaining over issues related to COVID-19. This is for not just for the new units, but in general. So if you've negotiated on your campus MOUs or new collective bargaining agreements that deal with the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of issues, we'd appreciate if you could let us know and submit them for us. We have keeping the data collection on that. And then finally, the next directory that we will be revisiting the entire higher education industry and looking at what's transpired in terms of the units identified in 2012, units identified this year in the supplementary directory, as well as other possible units that were missed in both directories. And then we hope to be able to have a national survey being conducted sometime next year. And so finally, just also mentioning that the 2020 supplementary directory is coming soon. We had hoped to have it prepared and issued before this conference. Unfortunately, we're still working on editing and proofing, but we should hopefully we'll have it out in the next couple of weeks. It's going to be an open access journal, which we'll be posting and getting the word out about. It has a lot of details, as I mentioned before, that has never been included in any directory. And we look forward to sharing it with you and getting, developing further research projects down the road. So again, thank you so much. So now I'd like to ask that Adriana, if she would now start with her commentary with respect to our findings and how her view of what we have found. Adriana?
Thank you so much, Bill and Joseph and Jacob, for this really important work. This helps document what I think many of us suspected, reading in the Chronicle of Higher Education and Inside Higher Education of various union movements on campuses, but now we can really see some of those trends all together. So I know I rely on this important work that the center does to really pull together those individual stories and trend lines. And it also parallels very much the work that I've been doing related to the Gig Academy that builds on Gary's work about academic capitalism, and seeing the ways that we are seeing the trends of exploitation of workers getting extended and expanded over the last few decades, and how that is resulting in a counter movement of, I think, a bit of a renaissance on union activity, and also just a real appreciation of the value and need for academic unions. So I suspect, and I'm so glad to hear that you're following up with some work related to the pandemic, because at least everywhere that I've been talking to, this is also increasing an understanding of how much workers are exploited, how they haven't had decision-making on coming back to teach or not, how not having health insurance or sick days is incredibly a vulnerable situation. So I think that the pandemic has really laid out more of these vulnerabilities, and we will likely see increased unionization over the coming years. So the trends in the report were very not surprising to me, given what I've seen over the years is that the non-tenure track faculty, postdocs, graduate student employees are increasingly seeing themselves as exploited as a part of the labor in higher education. And so the fact that that's where a lot of the activity is starting to stem from, and that's happening also in private institutions where there's also more of an opportunity legally for union efforts. So those trends, I think it's really nice to be able to capture them. What I'm hopeful of is that some of the implications of that, though, is that more of the workers across higher education will see more of their common interests and common plight. But I think that it's hopeful that there are many more of the groups that are organizing on campus. The degree to which different unions and different employees do come together, I think is an interesting question that I think that this group, I would love for us to have conversation about, or the ways they can come together. And so that question of, can a single union represent those different interests? Have they, they haven't always had a history of doing that. What would it mean for unions to think much more about the ways they can represent different groups more effectively? I think that's a real conversation that needs to be had, because there is some evidence that unions can be more effective when they are wall to wall, but whether they're as effective in representing those interests always, I think is continue to be an open question. It's really interesting to see some of those diagrams about how significant SEIU was in the private organizing space, for example. So capturing that, I think, I've been watching all their regional campaigns and their metro strategy and how effective that has been in various areas, but to see how prominent that activity is with organizing non-tenure track faculty, postdocs, and graduate students, I think was really interesting. Will help people to understand how the landscape is changing. And I think that also some of the other groups like the New Faculty Majority and CoCal, they've been helping to think about expanding, expanding the view of approaches to unionizing and groups that are being exploited, right? So we've had a lot of really important activity with activist groups, advocacy groups, working to help raise the consciousness across campuses of different groups that may not formally have seen themselves, particularly graduate students and postdocs, as workers in higher education. And so I think that that's going to continue, that they've been very effective, both some of the alternative labor organizing groups, but also the groups of unions outside of the traditional higher education unions. So I think just the more pressure there and the expanse is really beneficial for a future. And I think that like the question of, will we get more wall-to-wall bargaining, the question of, will groups across campus see themselves in a similar plight? And this is very much what I think Gary's work on academic capitalism and my work on the Gig Academy has been trying to point out, is every group is being affected by the same trends, and how they can see themselves in a common struggle is going to be really important to the future. And the role that professionalism that it's faced sometimes in the past in blocking the union activity, I see that eroding on my campus. On my own campus, we had a discussion just this last week of how can shared governance unions work together. I think increasingly some of the divides that have made a collective union movement challenging are going to fall away. So I see some of that happening. And those are some of the things that seemed exciting or interesting to me in the data. I'm going to hand it over to Gary, and then I'd love for us to have a discussion with some of the questions coming in.
Great, thanks, Adriana. And let me just echo, well, first, good afternoon for you all, but for Adriana and I, good morning out here in the West. I just want to echo what Adriana said. For scholars like herself and myself, the few academic scholars in our field of higher ed who study collective bargaining, but also for practitioners in the field. The work, Bill, that you and Jake and Joey are doing is just so incredibly important to give us a sense of what the trend lines are, what the patterns are. And I know you're even going into some deeper analysis. And I know in talking with Joey that he's doing that in his dissertation as well. So just profoundly important work of the center. And I'm delighted to be part of this panel. So what I want to do in my very brief time is kind of like Adriana, try and address some of the questions, Bill, that you set and that Adriana addressed for us to speak to. And one of them is just the overall pattern of growth that you identified, that all three of you identified. The increase of non-tenure track faculty, of postdocs and graduate student employee unions. And I guess what I want to emphasize is it's not just numbers, right? So the growth in numbers over time of each of these categories of employee actually is varied. For contingent faculty, it has been a pretty steady growth over 40 years. Graduate student employees have long been major players in the instructional workforce and the academic workforce. Postdocs are a much more recent development and a much more rapid growth in the late 90s and 2000s. So you can't really, I think, understand this growth over time, and especially the proliferation in the 2000s, just in terms of the number of employees. And a great quote that sort of captures this for me is a leading adjunct activist nationally, Caprice Lawless, who several years ago at a conference I was at, coined the phrase, "We need to go from awfulizing to organizing." And that is actually what we've seen in your data, that for these categories of employees, this growing sense of injustice, also a growing sense of possibility, and then new players in the field in terms of unions that are active in organizing employees, all have combined in the 2000s to contribute to this proliferation of organizing, primarily in the private sector, but it also bleeds over into growth, significant growth in the public sector as well. And part of that confluence and that sense of injustice, I want to emphasize, particularly given the fabulous sessions earlier today on Title IX and Black Lives Matter. I think it's not a coincidence that for faculty members who identify as women and for faculty members of color, the majority of those faculty members are in contingent positions. They are in contingent faculty positions. So that sense of injustice is not only an employment sense of injustice, it's connected to other social movements and larger senses of injustice about pay inequity, about structures of oppression. And I think that really plays into the organizing, not only of the contingent faculty, but also for graduate student employees. They are considerably more diverse as workforces than tenure stream faculty are. The same thing for postdocs. Their diversity and graduate students' diversity goes even more to the realm of international students and international postdocs. So I think that combination of factors, you can't understand what's going on in unionization in higher education without thinking about the larger politics of American society and the racism and the sexism, the patriarchy, the xenophobia. That is all contributing to this growth that we're seeing. Second point I want to make is about the significance, as you pointed out, of SEIU and UAW. Clearly, there's a long-standing debate about whether union competition is good for unions. I think here it most clearly has been. But it's also kind of, especially for contingent faculty, SEIU is most active in the private sector. Although they've had metro campaigns, a very successful one in Miami, for example, the Miami area in the public sector. But the three academic unions have continued to increase and grow in the public sector. And here, I think there's a re-energizing of the three academic unions by the activities of SEIU and UAW, by the activities of the new faculty majority and of COCAL, as Adriana mentioned, that bring together people, contingent and adjunct activists from different unions. I've been involved with NFM for many years, and they have people from the steelworkers, from SEIU, from AFT, from NEA, from AUP, pretty much all the big players in organizing contingent faculty. And that has re-energized the representation of the interests of contingent faculty within the NEA, within the AFT, within the AUP. And I have seen that firsthand and working pretty closely with all three of those unions. So I think there's a spillover effect that is really important to take into account of this incredible success of SEIU with contingent faculty in shaping the behavior of the three academic unions with regard to representing the interests and concerns of contingent faculty. And there was a nice question in the chat from Scott Douglas about, well, so are the voices of contingent faculty not fully represented within those three big unions? I think you could have said that many years ago. I think that is way less true today. And I think that's a function of the success of SEIU and of, as I said, the new faculty majority and the like. And I'd also say even on a unit level, you can see around the 2000s, a total re-energization of the Professional Staff Congress, as Luke Elliott Negri has written about, of the CFA, California Faculty Association, as Elizabeth Hoffman and John Hess have written about, and as Joe Barry and Helena Worthen are now about to publish a new book on the CFA, that these unions too took on much more energetic advocacy for contingent and adjunct faculty. And I guess that inside-outside strategy that operates at the national level, where you have activists creating their own organizations like COCAL and New Faculty Majority, but also within unions, where these contingent activists have affiliations outside those unions or in caucuses within the unions that leverage the three academic unions to pay more attention. And I think there's ample evidence that that is happening, maybe not to the extent that contingent and adjunct activists would like, but I think significant change. Then there's the long-standing question, like who best represents the interests of any one of these groups? And I think there's a couple of great commentaries on this. One by Joe Barry, another by Rich Moser, who's a longtime, like Joe, adjunct activist and labor leader. And the story kind of goes that some of the best contracts for contingent faculty are in the units that are combined, like CFA, but so are some of the worst. And in fact, it's pretty clear that the part-time only, the adjunct only bargaining units have had an incredible impact on wages, sort of bread and butter or bread and roses issues, wages, respect for the work, class cancellation fees. So I've got a couple of articles out on class cancellation fees and access to instructional resources and access to professional development, job security. On each of these matters, in a range of ways, the adjunct only units have been considerably more successful. But there's, again, a spillover effect. So I'm beginning to see those combined units begin to take on that kind of language. And there's a couple of activists in the audience, Leah Atkins and Laura Murphy from Dutchess Community College, who represent wonderful examples of that, where full-time and part-time faculty units are supporting each other. And I think a lot of that has to do with the success of the Metro campaigns, starting with Local 500 in DC, and I know Ann McClear's in the audience as well. That's had a larger impact on combined units as well. There are some issues and I'm actually writing a book right now, Organizing Professionals, that deals, I've just finished the 2 chapters on this. Some issues in which the combined units have a little bit more success in negotiating, for example, pay parity, not just a living wage, but parity with full-time faculty, as well as access to various forms of professional development. So I think both are important. It's not an either or issue. And I think there's like a spillover effect of what's going on. Final thing I'll say is about the times that we're in. I've written about academic capitalism. I'm now writing about disaster academic capitalism, how for so often disasters are in a sense taken advantage of to put on steroids the patterns that have already existed. But disasters are also times when there's tremendous bursts in organizing. And that was true back after the last recession. And I think it's happening again with COVID, with the combined effects of the pandemic, the recession, and the racial reckoning. And what I'm seeing across the nation is much more solidarity among all sorts of employees on campuses with regard to, as Adriana said, reentry. What are the terms of reentry? With regard to layoffs, with regard to furloughs. And so I see that in the emergence of new wall-to-wall units, even in states that don't have collective bargaining like my own. So I'm in a United Campus Workers Arizona local now, CWA local 7065. But I also see it in units that combine multiple segments of employees. And I'll just mention United Faculty at UIC, which is an AAUP AFT unit, and United Academics at the University of Oregon. I think probably maybe Dave Cecil's in the audience, which is also a combined AAUP AFT unit, in which the union has been very aggressive in trying to support and prioritize the interests of career track contingent lecturer faculty in a time of COVID. So I think these times actually, although the country itself is way more polarized, as Ann McClear said on a panel we did back in July, this polarization actually is serving organizing well because it clarifies what the battle lines are about. And what I see nationally is much more solidarity among various categories of employees, not just tenure stream and adjunct and contingent faculty, but faculty and graduate employees, faculty and postdocs, faculty and staff. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Gary. So I just, while picking up on what Gary and Adriana said, before we get to the questions, I just want to mention a couple of points about unit composition. First, we should remember that wall-to-wall units were the original form of collective bargaining in higher education. In the late 40s, the CIO, organized in higher education, rejected the construct of professionalism as a basis to split up units and organized 2 units at HBCUs. Going back to Gary's point about the Black Lives Matter panel, he says, why is that not known by people in higher ed? Well, there's an issue about history and knowledge of history, but the CIO did organize wall-to-wall units. And now what we're seeing is not just in Arizona, but in Mississippi, in Tennessee, in Colorado, efforts at wall-to-wall organizing, which is going on, which is really following in the steps of the CIO. And that's an interesting development. One other aspect to keep in mind is that sometimes having wall-to-wall units are prohibited or more difficult because of legal obstacles. So in some states, there's a requirement that contingent faculty be in separate bargaining units than the tenure track faculty. That's true in New York, but it's also in Illinois that the unit that Gary referenced originally was supposed to be a combined unit, and then based on a legal decision, they were split. But nevertheless, they have organized and bargained together, as Gary mentioned. And you see also in Rutgers where there's a unity, a coalition of unions that are now dealing with the administration together. So that's just sort of some points about unit composition that we should keep in mind. I want to go now to a question, ask either Jake or Joey to answer this, which is, during the past 7 years, has there been an uptick of decertifications of units? How many decertifications have we found in our directory?
As far as I know, Joey, you can back this up. I thought that there was only maybe one new DCERT in this 7-year period at Montana State. There was, for-profit DCERT too, but historically, that I don't know. We haven't looked at that at kind of decertification prior to 2012.
No, I'm talking
But-
about after 2012.
Yeah, after 2012, I think there was only the one that I know of. And Joey could back me up on that.
That's right.
That's right. And then the other thing, getting back to talking about composition, we did focus a lot on SEIU and how they almost exclusively represent non-tenure track faculty. The big three education units, I just went and looked at some of the numbers. It's almost a perfectly even split. The majority of newly represented faculty by those big three are actually in combined units, tenure track and non-tenure track. There's about 4,000 new employees in combined units, and about 3,000 each in exclusively tenure track units and 3,000 in exclusively non-tenure track. And that's who the AAUP, AFT, and NEA have newly represented during this period. So it's almost a perfectly even split. And the biggest group is these combined units of about 4,000, just to get some data out there.
So one other question was from Scott about that it appears that big education unions are and have been tilted towards representing tenure track faculty. Jake, going back to the figures that we have in our directory, what would be your response? Is that accurate based on our data?
You're saying historically or over this recent period?
It doesn't indicate.
Well, so over the recent period, that's what I was just addressing. They've almost evenly split their representation, so that it doesn't seem to be favored in one way or the other. Historically, we'd have to kind of dig through those numbers. I don't have the breakdowns right now.
And Joey, in terms of the for-profit sector, what are we seeing in terms of the for-profit sector, which we haven't even discussed at this point for good reason?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question and something that we keep track of in this recent directory. However, there are, so we recorded 6 new for-profit units. However, 3 of these units have since disbanded due to institutional closures. So it's certainly not the same level of growth that we see in among private nonprofit institutions. And in fact, much of the growth in fact, half of it has already been erased due to institutional closures. So it's quite a different industry, I think, and different terrain for organized labor as well.
Another question comes from David, which is asking for predictions. So I'll turn this over to Gary and Adriana. I'm not a very good predictor, but David asks, what do you predict will be the responses of institutions to the rise in organizing? More Supreme Court cases, or simply creating even more faculty types to further divide workers from each other?
What a great question. I do think that there's a possibility. So the trend has been to continue to divide, right? I mean, I think that one of the reasons, and I think it's really interesting, Gary, the position you talked about, that it's not either or, the competing versus wall to wall and coming together. But I do feel that the atomization that keeps happening and is working against groups having more power, and it does worry me because certain groups do have more power, and if they're working together, they can help support each other. So I think that the administration's strategy will be to try to create more divides among workers, to not be able to have them come together. And even through what I was been trying to trace is that what this does in sort of outsourcing staff and making it harder and harder for groups to come together, these various trends are working against that. So I think that all that we can do, honestly, that we will be better served as we can push and advocate for an agenda around collective action and allyship and breaking free from that kind of atomizing activity from the administration. I think we should be preempting that, knowing I feel pretty strongly that's where the trend lines have been.
So I think it's hard to get the crystal ball out in a time such a crazy time. except to say, as in the past, so in COVID and a time of COVID, and probably so post-COVID, there are factors which have led some administrations to not openly fight unionization. I mean, the grad student organizing in the private sector in the last several years has largely been voluntary recognition campaigns. A nice piece in the Post earlier this summer about that. Like, what happened? Why all of a sudden does Harvard and Brown? Well, it's not all of a sudden, but why now? So I think with the right circumstances and this confluence of social movements and the allyship that Adriana referred to, the more that these become justice oriented, and like at Georgetown, just employment policy that was put into place for janitorial employees, student activists were key in contributing to that. So that led to the administration not to actively fight the unionization of contingent faculty back in, I think, around 2012. I think the same thing is true now. At the same time, it is clear that there are administrations, Pitt, Duquesne, all around the country, who will continue. And I don't really like the union avoidance. It's union busting. It's not avoidance. It's actively trying to kill the prospects of unions emerging. And when you're in a pandemic and a recession and people are being thrown out of work, they don't have health care, I think we need to talk about like what's real. And so those are real battles. But in those battles too, I think it's a sense of justice and what colleges and universities as major employers, what are their as they're mostly nonprofit organizations, what are their public responsibilities by way of their employees? Just like what are their public responsibilities to their students. So I think we'll see both, but hopefully we'll see more of the voluntary recognition as this mobilization around various social movements, social justice movements, becomes more a part of the union movement, as I think it has been over the past decade.
And it's not only voluntary recognition. It's a question of values by institutions, and as
Yes.
Garrett said, there's a split, and part of that split is some institutions are not raising issues, and even a question of yeshiva. There are a couple of institutions which have not objected to faculty who are tenure track, very small number who are tenured who are being unionized. On the other side of it, you have some institutions which are using yeshiva in a very, as I mentioned before, in a very different way, where they're encouraging continued faculty to join shared governance, sometimes supported by union activists saying, oh yeah, it's a good idea to be involved with shared governance, and then turn around and the institutions then say, well, these continued faculty are managerial, and try to stop unionization. That happened at Adriana's institution, where that was specifically done and resulted in them being being turned out that they were found to be managerial by a court case. So there's definitely a split, and I think that split is tied with values. And I guess the question is putting pressure on institutions to have values, to recognize the fundamental rights that are set forth in laws as being, it's a fundamental right in the United States to be able to join a union and engage in collective bargaining.
Yeah, I think that's true. And we'd be remiss not to mention with graduate student employees, even as there are places that are voluntary recognizing, there are institutions in Pennsylvania, Penn State. This happened at the University of Oregon with an existing unit that essentially sent out warning signals about international graduate students potentially being deported if they become part of a union and have to strike. Right. So yeah, it's a question of values, right. And what do you invoke as an institution? Yeah,
the polarity. So we are about 3 minutes to the end of our session. So I'd like to invite final comments. If anyone wants, Jake and Joey, do you want to make final comments?
Did we want to talk about? Joey showed that slide that we saw a huge spike after the Columbia decision, but then someone might wonder, how come in 2019 the number was tiny?
I don't think we're gonna have time to cover
too much.
It's good to highlight that is an issue, and that may be tied to the fact that the NLRB has issued its proposed rule That-
That's kind of what I wanted to talk about, but yeah, we don't have a lot of time.
Joey, you want to wrap up?
I
closing
don't
remarks?
have any further comments. I just want to thank again Adriana and Gary for.
Yeah, thank you both.
on the
Very
table.
happy to have you look at our stuff.
It's
So-
great stuff. It's
Yeah,
great.
It is
Yeah.
wonderful. One final comment, if I could.
Please.
Just, I want to reinforce what Gary said about the racial justice issues um, and social justice issues in general, but particularly now the racial justice issues. It's not only the right thing to do in the organizing efforts, but it's tactically very smart, as institutions are afraid now of looking racist at this moment. And I think we should be doing it because it's the ethical thing. And I think unions have been struggling with the ways that they can, get out their own systemic racism. And this is a time to be leaning into that, against the sexism, the racism, and having unions really support that. And so I think that is something that everyone should be thinking about, everyone should be behind. So if there's one thing I wanted to make sure we left with, pulling up that from Gary's comments. So thanks, Gary, for bringing that up.
And thank you
Yeah.
Adriana, for finishing. So for people, you should know you have to go to our next session. We have a plenary session on student debt, as well as welcome remarks, greetings from one of our sponsors. You need to go back to the conference landing page for a link to that. Thank you, Adriana and Gary. It's been a pleasure. Appreciate all your comments. And Jake and Joey, it's a delight to work with you. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for coming, everyone.